I love cycling. Cycling is a great way of getting around. I've always been someone who cycles. I cycle to work and back every day, and why not? It's good for you. We've got some great cycle paths around here. It keeps you fit and healthy and strong, and there's no traffic. But you can see by the way I'm holding my head up, every year as I do more and more mileage, you get a pain in the neck. It's the back of your neck holding your head up. And we talked about the muscles at the back, and essentially they're extending from the neck, extending to their head. I've never really pulled them all together before, so let's have a look at the muscles of the posterior neck, the muscles that hold your head up when you're cycling. So, the muscles of the neck, what might cause a pain in the neck, and what muscles exactly am I strengthening, and what muscles are getting fitter when I'm cycling and holding my head up for a long period of time. So we'll do the usual thing we do with muscles, is we'll start superficial and then we'll go deep. I find textbooks, many of them don't really talk about the muscles of the neck in isolation. We're just going to look at the muscles of the posterior neck. The lateral and the anterior ones are probably on my to-do list. But this does also relate to the muscles of the back. So we've looked at the muscles of the back before. There are so many of them, we've done them in different layers. So those muscles still apply in the neck, but there are some extra muscles that run through the neck of the back that attach to the skull and move the head and the neck and that sort of thing. So we'll talk about the movements of the cervical vertebrae and the head. Talk about the muscles. Don't forget that although if you have a pain in the neck, I got kids, so otherwise if you've got a pain in the neck, it might be musculoskeletal, it might be one of these muscles that's involved, but it might also be joint between the vertebrae or intervertebral disc or some other connective tissue around there. Of course, we've got a lot of nerves in here as well. It might be the muscles affecting the alignment of cervical vertebrae. All sorts of things can cause a pain in the neck. But if we look at the muscles, it's a good start, right? It's a good bit of anatomy. It's a good bit of anatomy. So the movements of the neck and the head are the same as the movements of the vertebral column as a whole. So we have flexion and extension, and you might want to go as far as hyperextension, but flexion and extension, and then we have this lateral movement side to side. That would be called lateral flexion, lateral flexion. Do I go further on one side than the other? Equally tight at the moment. And then we've got, of course, a rotation. And remember that we're symmetrical animals-ish, mostly, certainly in terms of the muscles, which means that when we're talking about the muscles, there's one on either side, and if they work together, they might cause one movement, as in on the two different sides. But if just one side works and the other side relaxes, they can cause a different movement, right? Or a different movement. So we have to consider that as well, muscles working together or working on their own. Alright, trapezius. To talk about the muscles of the back, we do need to know a few things. We need to consider the vertebrae. Well, that's what I've got, skeleton, right? We'll look at the vertebrae and the bits of the vertebrae as we go. But when we think about particularly the neck and the superficial things, we have to think about this thing in the midline here. Right, so the spinous processes of the vertebrae are covered by the supraspinous ligament. And the supraspinous ligament, when it gets up into the neck, when it gets up here, it becomes what's called the nuchal ligament. So it continues and then runs up to this is the occipital bone up here. And you can feel this, right? So about the level of your collar, there's a big bony lump, and that's the spinous process of C7, of the seventh cervical vertebra. Now, between there and your skull, and if you feel the back of your skull has got a knobbly bit on it. That's the external occipital protuberance, because there's one on the other side which would be the internal one. See, the external occipital protuberance is this lumpy bit. If ever we have a lumpy bit, it's because things are attaching to the bone there. Oh, and there's a ridge underneath here, which is the median nuchal line. So we've got these lines here where we show attachments. Now, so there is the nuchal ligament is kind of like that. It's kind of like a flat thing running through there, because of course we've got this nice curve. So if you take your extended neck and you flex it, you can feel that nuchal ligament stringing up between the external occipital protuberance and the spinous process of C7. So imagine that as a flat, as a wedge in there, and it's a great thing for muscles to attach to. So the nuchal ligament, and that is where a lot of trapezius is attached to there, right? Particularly in the neck. And it's an important idea. So the most superficial muscle in the neck is trapezius, and trapezius is this lovely trapezoid, this lovely shaped muscle up here which runs across here and down here. So trapezius in the neck is attached to the nuchal ligament, it's attached to the external occipital protuberance, it's attached to the spinous process of the C7 vertebra, and in fact it's attached to the spinous processes down to T12. We talk about trapezius as having upper fibres, middle fibres and lower fibres, and trapezius runs and attaches to the clavicle here. Clavicle, see, I always get these two, I know the thing, I know the word, it's like red and blue I get back to back for whatever reason. But trapezius attaches to the scapula here, here's the spine of the scapula, here's the acromion, and it attaches to the clavicle here anteriorly. So trapezius' main job is in the upper limb. It's in rotating the scapula, moving the scapula around, and your upper limb is hanging from the scapula. That's its job. But it's running from the neck and the skull to the scapula. So you would expect it to have some role in movements of the neck and the head. And if you read textbooks, that's generally not described. And I think a lot of the reason for that is that the fibres are running in this direction, and because they're attaching to the nuchal ligament, they're not actually doing much in terms of moving the neck or the head. They're kind of pulling on the wrong things. You see how these fibres are running up here to the external occipital protuberance, which means that the trapezius does have a role in extending the head, lifting the head up, but there are other muscles which are better suited for it. But that's trapezius there. Trapezius, of course, is innervated by the accessory nerve, cranial nerve 11, which pops out around here, and a few of the spinal nerves, C3, C4, have a role as well. Anyway, trapezius is the most superficial muscle. If we take trapezius off, then we see the next deeper layer on this side, and it's this guy that really stands out here. We've got two muscles, and they're both called splenius. And do you remember there was a trend in the back? We'd have a muscle like iliocostalis, and they would have another name depending upon what region it was in. So here we have two splenius muscles. One's called capitis, so caput means it attaches to the head, and one's called cervicis, which means it's just attaching to the cervical vertebrae. It's got a role in the neck. Splenius, splenium means bandage, so the idea is that the splenius muscles are wrapping around the deeper muscles of the neck like a bandage. So, this guy, he's going up to the skull, so this is going to be splenius capitis, caput. Remember this bony bit here, which you can feel just behind the ear? This is the mastoid process. So the other muscle we've got with trapezius is sternocleidomastoid. Haven't really mentioned it because it's lateral and anterior. So sternocleidomastoid, that lovely superficial muscle in the neck that you can see as people move their heads and necks. Sternocleidomastoid runs from the mastoid process down to the clavicle and the sternum, so they can both if they work together, they bring the chin towards the sternum. If they work independently, they can rotate and what have you. The reason I mention them is because we're going to find a lot of muscles today are attaching to the mastoid process. So they're going to be attaching to the mastoid process deep to sternocleidomastoid. The real challenge is going to be finding out what we can actually see on these models, because I haven't looked yet. So if we look on this model, here's trapezius. I can take trapezius off this side. So splenium capitis, if I take off sternocleidomastoid as well, the splenium muscles are deep to trapezius, but they're still superficial muscles. They're more superficial than the many deep layers deep to them. They are flat, they are thick, and they are strong. And they run from the nuchal ligament and from the spinous processes, typically described as C7, to about T6. And can you see how the fibres are running in a superolateral direction up to the mastoid process and the superior nuchal line here. The external occipital protuberance is around there. So you can see that if they both act together, they will give extension of the neck. So these are probably the muscles that get sore when I'm cycling for long periods of time and holding my head up, because these are doing quite a bit of work. And if one side works on its own, then they can help with lateral flexion from side to side. Splenius cervicis then is similar, but it's not running up to the skull, it's running from the spinous processes of the vertebrae to the transverse processes, right? Running from these spinous processes down here up to the transverse processes, so running still in that direction to vertebrae C1 to C4, so they're just involved in the neck. So again, they can pull the cervical vertebrae back, and then Splenius capitis is also pulling the head back. So splenius cervicis, splenius capitis, those are the next two muscles when we take off trapezius. Now while we're here, actually, while we're talking about trapezius and what have you, the other muscle that I'm a big fan of down here is this one. There's trapezius. We take trapezius off, we see splenius capitis down here, and we're seeing, look, the scapula. There's the spine of the scapula there, there's the acromion, and we've got, well, there's the rhomboids down there, but the muscle I'm interested in is this one here. This is levator scapulae, and levator scapulae is again running from the transverse processes of the cervical vertebrae, but levator scapulae tells you where it goes. It goes down to the medial border of the scapula, but like at the superior end, like the superior third of it. So it helps levate the scapula, helps lift the scapula, but it does more than that, because what's going on here is rotation. But there's levator scapulae there, right. So the transverse processes of C1 to C4 are up here, and levator scapulae then runs down across here to this is the medial side of the scapula, just in the upper third there. So trapezius is, as I said, it's, and all these other muscles around here are rotating the scapula. So you can see how, if that muscle shortens, it pulls the scapula that way, helps with rotation and that sort of thing. But the other thing it does is it helps with stabilization. This is a muscle that's running to the transverse processes of the cervical vertebrae from the scapula. So it's more lateral than trapezius, which is running, essentially to the nuchal ligament, to the midline, to the spinous processes. So, if you're lifting a heavy weight, for example, if you're doing a deadlift in the gym, you've got good neutral form, and your head's in the midline, and you're lifting a heavy weight, what's going to happen when you turn your head and turn your neck, maybe to look in the mirror to check your form? Well, the two levator scapulae muscles, one's going to try and get shorter, and the other one's going to try and get longer under a heavy load, because in that situation they're both helping support the scapulae in place and bear the load that you've got to your arms, right? So not a good thing, I think And yeah, I've heard about lifters complaining about looking too high. I don't see that that's an issue anyway. But consider, you know, so if you've got good neutral form, your two levator scapulae are doing the same job on either side, nice and even, and then you twist your head and your neck when you're lifting that heavy load, what's going to happen to levator scapulae? It's probably not going to be too happy about it. In fact, this is something that Kim does when she's climbing. You've seen us climbing, right, if you've watched the vlogs. Because again, we're doing the same thing. We're in these awkward movements. We've got putting a lot of power through our upper limbs. We're stabilising our scapulae so we can balance ourselves and pull and what have you. If she then turns her head in the wrong direction, bam, she'll fire off that levator scapulae. She'll crick her neck. It'll go into spasm, lots and lots of pain, and have to like noogie it, you know, to get the knots out. So I think it's levator scapulae that does that in her, because it's always when she turns her head, when she's loading her upper limbs. So these are the muscles we can see: trapezius, splenius, capitis, levator scapulae. Those are the superficial ones. Now we've got to go a layer deeper, which I probably don't have a model of. Pipe cleaners, right, red ones, these are going to be muscles today, not arteries, alright? Do you remember when we were looking at the muscles of the back and we looked at Erector spinae or Erector spinae, which is this kind of massive muscle here. That's the when you're doing what I'm doing right now, that's the wedge, like the ridge of muscle you can feel on either side of your vertebrae. So you've got this groove in the middle, got a nice wedge of muscle, hopefully on either side. And Erector spinae or spinae is actually a group of lots of muscles. And in fact, we even group those muscles into groups. So we talked about three groups of muscles. We've got iliocostalis. So think ilium and ribs, iliocostalis. Then we have longissimus, long ones, which is the middle set. And then we have spinalis, closest to the spine, so the spinalis. And then at different levels, whether they're like lumbar or thoracic or cervical in the neck, we then give them another name to describe whereabouts they were. Well, these extend up into the neck. Some of them are not terribly interesting for us today, but some of them extend up to the head, so they are interesting to us today. And that's what this deeper layer of muscle is that we can see under here. So iliocostalis cervicis, the most lateral set of muscles in Erector spinae, run from the ribs to the lateral processes, the transverse processes rather, of vertebrae C4, C5, C6. So kind of across like that, right? Probably not terribly interesting to us today. You can see how they'd have a role in kind of, you know, extending the lower part of the neck, but they're not acting across the neck as a whole. So that's iliocostalis cervicis, not terribly interesting today. If we go a little bit more medially then, we have longissimus capitis. Don't know if it might be long enough. So that's the next layer in. These are running from the transverse processes of the upper thoracic vertebrae and maybe the lower cervical vertebrae, and they run up to the mastoid process. They're nice and long, and there's a bunch of them, right, running at different lengths from the different vertebrae and what have you, but it's a nice massive muscle. And so if you've got two of those on either side, you can see how these would do quite a good job at extending the neck and pulling the head backwards. So that's longissimus capitis because it's going to the head. So then if we go a little bit more medially, the medial-most set are spinalis, and we have spinalis muscles that also attach to the head, to the skull. So these are spinalis capitis. Now, spinalis capitis doesn't get talked about as much as semispinalis capitis, which is actually a deeper muscle of the back, but we'll get there. Spinalis capitis runs from the nuchal ligament and from the spinous processes of C7 to T4-ish up to the occipital bone up here. So that's our medial most set of erector spinae muscles, so that's spinalis capitis. But it doesn't get talked about much because it tends to blend with the muscle fibres of semispinalis capitis, which gets talked about far more. So that would be your intermediate layer of muscles, the erector spinae group there. Now, beyond that, there are deep muscles and then like deep muscles. I'm not going to talk about the deep muscles because the deep muscles are running between adjacent vertebrae, and the deep muscles at the back that we talked about in that other video, that's also happening in the neck. That's, you know, it's in the neck. They do the same thing in the neck as they do everywhere else pretty much. I've already talked about it. So the last one we want to talk about, I think, is semispinalis capitis. So of the deeper muscles of the back, so deeper to the erector spinae group, we talk about multifidus and rotatores, and we talked about semispinalis. Now the semispinalis muscles are running between the spinous processes of some vertebrae and the transverse processes of other vertebrae a few vertebrae away. All right, so they're running like a shallow diagonal like this up the vertebral column. They're fairly deep. Now up in the neck they do a similar thing, but they run from the transverse processes up to the occipital bone. So we have a semispinalis capitis muscle, and it's this semispinalis capitis muscle that spinalis capitis blends with. So these are running from the transverse processes of, well, the transverse processes and the articular processes of C4 through to about, what, T6 or something? 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's quite a long muscle. So in fact it's too long for my pipe cleaners, isn't it? But imagine you've got, you know, a fair old muscle running kind of that away, and then you've got, you know, shorter ones up here and other ones, you know, in between. Do you get the idea? So this is all semispinalis capitis, and then they kind of form this fairly broad attachment to the occipital bone back here, running from these transverse processes and up, and that's semispinalis capitis. So you can see again that this muscle, if both sides are working together, it's going to have a good effect on extending the neck. Yeah, that's about it, I think. Oh, that's the muscle we can see on here, right? So actually pulling all this together has been quite useful for me, because if you think about the muscles of the back, there are just far too many. So if you just think about the neck rather than trying to add the neck onto the back, it's a bit easier. So trapezius is our most superficial muscle here. Its major role is in the shoulder and the scapula. There's the nuchal ligament there. If we take trapezius off, we see the splenius muscles. In particular, we see Splenius capitis because it's running up to the mastoid process here. We see levator scapulae running from the transverse processes of those cervical vertebrae down to the medial part of the scapula there. And then here, these muscle fibres that are attaching to the occipital bone back here, these must be semispinalis capitis and spinalis capitis blending together there, those deeper muscles. Spinalis capitis being part of the erector spinae or spinae group, and semispinalis capitis being the deeper group, but nonetheless forming a fairly substantial muscle there attaching to the occipital bone. It's not so bad when you break it down. It's nice and neat, isn't it? Okay, that's it, the muscles of the posterior neck. So now when you do that, you know where you're palpating, right? I can feel all these things. Okay, so that's just the posterior neck. I mean, we talk about muscles of the neck when we come across other things, like we mentioned the scalenes, we talk about the strap muscles when we look at this, that and the other. I should probably do the strap muscles, I'll put it on me it's already on my to-do list. We'll do the other muscles of the neck one day, but for today, that's enough. And if you want to, like I say, if you want to look at the other muscles of the neck, go and look at the deep muscles of the back. There are some specific deep muscles that do something a little bit different attaching to the skull, but I'm not doing that now. That's way more detail than most people need. Right, see you next week. Oh, cup of tea.